Memorial Professor of International Affairs, Ethics, and Human Behavior at George Washington University. The program, this noon discussion, is a joint program between the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Rabin Chair Forum of George Washington University, one of an occasional series in which we partner to have various meetings. The title of the talk is The Rise and Demise of the Two-State Solution in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. My role here is primarily as the chair. We only have an hour. I would like you to know that this is being webcast, and cell phones interfere with the process of the webcasting. So if you could all please turn off your cell phones, it would be very good. I've just turned off mine, and I'd be grateful if you would do that as well. As all of you know, there have been numerous solutions put forward to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of how to solve it, how many states there should be. The most common assumption, at least recently, has been, and by recently I mean quite a long time, number of years, has been two states. It's been official U.S. policy. But there have been many other ideas. One-state solution, in a recent op-ed, Muammar Gaddafi, no less, offered the idea of an Israeltine. And in response to that, somebody from Wellesley said, how about a Libgypt? So there are problems with all kinds of solutions.
He's ready.
Pardon?
He's ready.
He's ready. Oh, you mean Gaddafi's ready for a Libgypt? Maybe. Recently, Thomas Friedman had a five-state solution in the New York Times. I won't go into the details of his five-state solution, but the point is that there are many ideas. The most common one, however, obviously, and certainly the one behind which America has put most of its energies, and many others as well, is a two-state solution. All ideas deserve examination because things are always changing, and it's also valuable to look at the history of every idea to understand where it comes from. Also, clearly, everyone who talks about the subject has his or her own background and approach on these matters. Today we'll have an opportunity to hear from one person who's dealt with this for a good bit of time and in a very serious way. Efraim Inbar is professor of political studies at Bar-Ilan University and the director of its Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He was born in Romania in 1947, was educated at the Hebrew University and at the University of Chicago, where he received his MA and PhD in political science. He served as visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University, at Georgetown, visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center here. He was appointed as Manfred Warner NATO Fellow in 1998, and was a visiting fellow and professor at numerous universities. His area of specialization is Middle Eastern strategic issues with a special interest in the politics and strategy of Israeli national security. He's written over 60 articles in professional journals. He's authored 5 books, Outcast Countries in the World Community, War and Peace in Israeli Politics, Labor Party Positions on National Security, Rabin and Israel's National Security, which was published by the Woodrow Wilson Center Press, the Israeli-Turkish Entente, and Israel's national security issues and challenges since the Yom Kippur War. I'm grateful that all of you have come here to engage in this discussion. I'm especially grateful that Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn has come, who's chair of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and Hala Esfandiari, who's the director of the Middle East program and who has helped make this meeting possible, and with whom I always find it a very great pleasure to work. Thank you, Hala. And I'm grateful also to the director and president of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Honorable Lee Hamilton. So I will take up no more time and pass the microphone to my colleague to my right.
Thank you, Walter. It's a pleasure being here again at the Wilson Center. For the sake of intellectual transparency, to make it quite clear, I'm not against the two-state solution. I was actually in favor. I'm a Rabinist in my way of thinking, and I simply reach the conclusion that it doesn't work. So what I'll try to do in the short time I was allotted is to trace to some extent this, the history of this idea, to show why it doesn't work, and if time permits, to offer some suggestions what can be done to minimize the misery in my region. The Arab-Israeli conflict is a complicated conflict. It is basically what we call in social science jargon a compound conflict, which is made out of two separate conflicts. One is the ethnic conflict between us and the Palestinians, two people fighting over the same land. And apart from that, there is another component to the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is the state-to-state conflict between Israel and the Arab states. Until 1947, the conflict was primarily intercommunal. The two communities were fighting against each other. There was very little Arab states' involvement. And because of the tensions, the British, who were the imperial power at the time, decided to try partition into two states. This is what they've done in India as well. It was common sense at that time. It's still common sense. If two communities don't get along together, let's separate them, and each one will live its own life. At that time, the Zionist national movement accepted the two-state solution. The Arabs rejected it. They didn't accept a Jewish state. Again, in 1947, it was put forward by the United Nations, the two-state solution, and again, the Arabs rejected it because they didn't want to give legitimacy to this idea of having a Jewish state in the land of Israel. The second stage, from 1948 to 1967, was primarily interstate conflict. As a result of the 1948 war, there was a partition, a de facto partition of the land of Israel, of Palestine, but not into two states. Actually, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians that conquered during the 1948 war parts of Palestine ruled over those areas. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. During this stage, of course, there was no attempt to establish the two-state solution. They didn't want to establish a Palestinian state. And no two-state solution paradigm was on the international agenda. At this stage, it was characterized by interstate wars, 48, 56, 67. And at the end of 67, actually the November 67 242 resolution doesn't treat the Palestinians as a collective with political rights that are entitled to establish a state, but rather as a refugee issue, a humanitarian problem. The third stage started indeed after 67 until 93, Oslo. And at this stage, we had the intercommunal conflict as well as interstate conflict. What we see during this period basically is the rise of the two-state paradigm, and the reasons are complex. First of all, it is because of the decline of the interstate dimension in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Basically, after 79, when Egypt made peace with Israel, defected the Arab military coalition, the Arab lost an important military power to fight Israel, and since then we see a decline in the Arab-Israeli conflict. The interstate, some people say it's over, I'm not sure, but obviously this dimension has been weakened, and since we indeed have less wars, interstate wars. We had, the attrition war in 70, 73 the Yom Kippur War. 82, I'm not sure, it was to some extent an interstate war with the Syrians, but also a war against, at the ethnic level against the Palestinians. Basically, we see separate from the decline of the interstate solution, greater importance to the ethnic dimension, or what we call Palestinization of the conflict. First of all, we see a crystallization of the Palestinian identity because of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. They identified as a separate group vis-a-vis the Israeli, who were very different ethnically, religiously. Gradually, we see greater recognition for the PLO. Once it was just a terrorist organization, gradually it becomes a voice, accepted voice of the Palestinian national aspirations. And in 74, it got an observer status at the UN. Basically, it was done via terror, but it was effective. In 78, we see at Camp David accords between the Egyptians and the Israelis. First time Begin agreed to link Gaza to the West Bank under the autonomy plan. And since then, we see indeed the Palestinians coalescing. Those are the two entities who became clearly one issue. December 87, of course, we have the First Intifada, which is low-intensity conflict against Israel. It's not a conventional warfare, and it receives tremendous attention in the international arena. And an important change took place in Algiers in 1988, when the PLO finally accepts the 47 partition suggested plan by the UN, 41 years later, but still better than not accepting it. And then the PLO also became committed to a two-state solution. An important development is, of course, the Israeli political development, domestic. There is a great erosion in Israel against what Israelis call the third state, which is the West Bank having a separate status, when most of the time the Israelis were in favor of what Israeli calls the Jordanian option, basically trying to relink the West Bank to the Jordanians. And indeed, in 1993, Rabin, who was the most powerful advocate of the Jordanian option, agrees to Oslo. He was still ambivalent about the two states. He accepted a state in Gaza. He was less committed to having a state in the West Bank. And indeed, we see afterwards, after the Israelis made the Oslo Agreement, an international acceptance of the two-state paradigm, including the Americans. The Americans were actually the last ones to accept the two-state solution. The fourth stage in this, after Oslo, is a de facto partition of land of Israel, of Palestine, between the Israelis and the PA. Most of the area, populated area, was transferred fully under the authority of the PA, the new established PA, and we saw the beginning of an attempt to seriously implement the two-state solution, giving control to the Palestinians over most of the Palestinians. So from 1993 to year 2000, we see an attempt to implement the two-state solution, but it failed. There was a Camp David meeting between Barak, Arafat, and President Clinton was not successful, and we see the beginning of a second intifada, and this indeed a cutoff date for the period, and we start a new stage in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in my view, this is when we start seeing the failure of the two-state paradigm. Basically, what we see is the Palestinians establishing a failed state, And a state, you know, in a modern state, according to Max Weber, is a place where there is a monopoly over use of force, over the organs of violence. And of course, the Palestinians failed in that respect. Arafat allowed militias and eventually degenerated into what the Palestinians call fawda, lack of law and order. And this finally culminated in the June 2007 takeover by Hamas of Gaza, which further fragmented the Palestinian entity, political entity, whatever you call it. Basically, what we see at the end of the period, and this is not always fully realized, that this two-state paradigm had two main assumptions that don't work. The first assumption is that there is the possibility of reaching a compromise, a historic compromise between the Zionist national movement and the Palestinian national movement, and they failed to do so at Camp David in year 2000. And I don't think the differences are bridgeable in the near future. Actually, what is happening is that the Palestinian society is being radicalized by the growing political power of Hamas. And of course, they are ideologically against the mere existence of a Jewish state. It's a religious sacrilege from their point of view, which puts them further away for any possible compromise. Even the PLO, which is largely discredited, I'm not sure they were really ready for accepting a Jewish state next to them. You know, Abu Mazen before Annapolis refused to the American prodding to accept a Jewish state. But maybe the PLO is probably more moderate. And also on the Israeli side, I think the assumptions that the Israelis are going to divide Jerusalem is unsubstantiated. Israelis still are ready to fight over Jerusalem. Basically, we see two societies in this protracted ethnic conflict which still have a lot of energies to fight. This type of conflicts usually end when the people get tired of it. And from what I see, neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians are tired enough to finish the conflict. This is one of the clear reasons why this compromise is not available. And the second assumption was that given the opportunity to establish a state, the Palestinians will be able to establish a state. And we know it didn't work. And this is maybe part of a larger malaise, in the Arab world. There are, Somalia. You see the problems in Iraq after Americans destroyed the central center, the power of Saddam Hussein, the dictator. So it's something that it will not be easily overcome. I think we see also a decline in the attractiveness of a Palestinian state, even for the Palestinians. They are fed up with lack of order, with and I think they are looking for other things. And clearly Hamas is not an alternative because we have to realize that it is an Islamist organization. It is not necessarily nationalist. His agenda is more to establish maybe a political structure of the Ummah, of the Muslim nation, and it's so it's not clear that even if they'll take over the West Bank, it will be a clear state. And by the way, they are also failing in this critical area of monopoly over use of force, because even in Gaza today, we have splinter groups, we have clans that have their own weapons, and they are using them without asking the Hamas leadership. I think by now we see also a tacitly international recognition of the problem with a two-state solution, and this is clearly exemplified by the Annapolis process. Basically, the Annapolis process, which was an attempt to re-energize the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians, its end goal was very clear. It called for a shelf agreement. Basically, what does it mean, a shelf agreement? Let's negotiate an agreement, put it on the shelf. When the conditions will be ripe, maybe when the Palestinians will be able to implement, then we'll come back to it. So basically, even the international community realizes that this is not working, and we see, even in the international press, you mentioned Tom Friedman, but even the London Times, which is not very friendly to Israel, is success. So we see more and more in the international press discussions of the futility of this paradigm. So what can be done? Not much. One approach is, of course, to try to nation building or state building. This is what the Americans are trying to do with the PA. I think that this approach is based on several fallacies. Palestinian society cannot be easily reformed by outsiders. Political engineering generally is very problematic in the Middle East. Outsiders have a bad record in making the natives nice or democratic or whatever the Europeans or the Westerners think that they should be. Abu Mazen, of course, is not an agent for change. Abu Mazen is a very weak leader. Unfortunately, the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world doesn't have a Ataturk that will bring them into a modern world, and they suffer from very poor leadership. And Abu Mazen is not that different, only that he is not a dictator, a full dictator. Economic aid is not very helpful because it really doesn't filter down. There is a rich literature about the ineffectiveness of foreign aid in cases where there is no real infrastructure, legal, bureaucratic, administrative, for absorbing this type of leadership. And if you read today's newspaper, you see the UN accuse Hamas of taking over the aid that they sent into Gaza. And let's face it, humanitarian aid is usually taken by the guys with the guns, and they take most of the shares, if not all of it. I think also, the belief that Palestinian society can be transformed quickly into a good neighbor for Israel is not realistic. The education system, where the Shaheed is the model, the role example it's still there, and it will take many years to change it. Another option is, of course, and also I think that the takeover of Hamas cannot be easily reversed. I know there are attempts at national unity, talks between Hamas and the PA. I doubt very much if Hamas will really give up their power in Gaza and to be more nicer to Abu Mazen, who is totally delegitimized in their eyes and in many eyes of the Palestinians. So what I suggest is to try to drop the two-state paradigm and to be realistic what can be done. One option is to go back to the partition of pre-67, basically to give a greater role to the Egyptians in Gaza and to give a greater role of the Jordanians in the West Bank. I know that nobody wants Gaza. I know there is good reasons for the Egyptians to keep away, but the alternative of having a Hamastan is not that appealing, because Hamastan may have bad influence over the domestic politics in Egypt, but they are drawn into Gaza. We see their role after the war in Gaza. We see a greater involvement in those affairs, and I'm not talking about annexation. I'm not always in favor of neat solutions. Some kind of informal agreement, and the same can be true about Jordan. I think we may have a Badr force, a Jordanian force there. I think there are clear polls showing that the Palestinians are ready for some kind of Jordanian intervention. We can finesse the issue speaking about a Jordanian-Palestinian federation. So in any case, those two countries, Egypt and Jordan, are countries, responsible countries, and they have peace treaty with Israel, and it's better for us and for the Palestinians to be ruled by Arab countries by their own methods. And I think also, if we talk about Palestinian identity, you know, it's a young identity, and you know, as a Jew, I've seen, you know, people coming and go, so many identities over the years. So I don't think it's impossible for the Palestinians, the West Bank, to become again Jordanians, or the Gazans to have a new identity, Egyptian identity whatsoever. I think that in Israel, this type of approach is called regional approach. It may well, you know, be accepted by the Americans. After all, your new president is speaking about a regional approach. And I think that we should allow greater involvement of the Arabs into Palestinian affairs if they want to put their money where the mouth is. You know, it's not only Israel's problem. The last option, which will probably happen, you know, is conflict management. I think that, and I'm going to say something that is not easy to hear by American ears, that, you know, not every problem has a solution in life. You know, so let's be realistic. You know, some problems don't have a solution, and of course I can understand American optimism and trying to do well, to do good for people, but it doesn't always work. So we may have to live with this type of you know, unpleasant situation for a while, and to move from conflict resolution to conflict management. It's ambiguous, it's unclear, it doesn't have a clear end goal, but what Israelis and foreigners should try to do is basically to minimize the suffering for both sides, to try to a very gradual approach to change things, particularly in the Palestinian education system, to try to weaken to some extent, you know, Hamas, what the international community today is doing, trying to reconstruct Gaza. I'm not sure it's strategically sound, because it should be clear to the Palestinians that only if they are ruled by PLO, by moderate Abu Mazen, they'll have a better chance, rather, you know, than helping the people that are under Hamas. So I know time is limit. I'm not a man with you know, a peace vision. I'm a realist by nature, and we should try to move, I believe, into this direction of conflict management, hoping that time will allow for better circumstances, and there will be less use of force, less suffering on both sides. And I'll end on this happy note.
Thank you. I'm glad you said you'd end on this happy note, because if we didn't have a question, which we do, I would have asked you what keeps you an optimist. Because as long as I've known Efraim, I've known him to be an optimist in a world in which there isn't always a great deal of basis for optimism. But fortunately, there is a question already back there, if I'm not mistaken. If you could identify yourself.
They have to pass the microphone, I think.
Is there a microphone?
Yeah.
Yes. Remember, please, this is a discussion.
Yeah,
and
no,
so,
Alan Brown from the Canadian Embassy.
I'm sorry, could you repeat
Alan Brown from the Canadian Embassy.
Oh.
Just a question about, you said in your closing remarks that perhaps this situation will take more time to come up with a better solution. I want, and given Mitchell's recent tour of the region and his talk before going and his work on the Mitchell Report of sort of an emphasis on freezing settlements construction in the West Bank and Gaza, I wonder what kind of advice you give to the American government and to the new incoming Israeli government on the issue of settlement construction.
What advice Mitchell does, or do I give?
I was wondering what your advice would be.
Well, my position has always been that I'm in favor of partition of the land as Israel, and I do not favor Jewish settlement in isolated places near Arab population centers. But having said that, I think that the issue of settlements is an exaggerated issue for the following reason: that the Israeli political system has demonstrated several times that it is capable, when it is tested, to remove Jewish settlers when there is a chance for some kind of better life afterwards. We are, of course, wrong in Gaza, but also already with Egypt, we removed settlements. So we can do it if necessary. But I think everybody knows here that the Bush letter, about the settlement blocks is something that the Israelis obviously cherish very much. The settlement issue is part of this protracted conflict between the two communities over land. We are like cowboys. We fight over land, over water. This is very important to Israelis. Most settlements, most settlers are indeed concentrated in those areas around Jerusalem and not far from, 5 minutes from Kfar Saba, from Tel Aviv. So I think the Israeli government and the Israeli public is ready to accept a renewed partition, which will necessitate removal of some settlements. So this is my advice to my government, probably to Bibi.
There is a question back there. If you could please identify yourself.
My name is Ibrahim Hussein. I am an Egyptian living here in Washington, D.C. I don't represent anybody, just myself. In your list of alternatives and history of this, you did not mention anything about the Arab Initiative, Prince Abdullah Initiative. And I guess last week, Perez informally said he likes it. But what is the Israeli position on it? And I'd like to know, how could you remove the 300,000 settlers in the West Bank if your regional suggestion is made?
First of all, no Israeli government will remove 300 settlers.
300,000.
To make it quite clear to everybody. It's impossible, and we will not do it. We'll remove isolated settlements. Most Israelis see it as all land of Israel as being its homeland, and they are entitled to be there. I would say there is no reason to have a Palestine which is Judenrein. Why can't Jews be citizens, if they want to be citizens of a Palestinian state, accepting, of course, Palestinian citizenship and everything? I think it's a very anti-Semitic, racist position to remove all settlements by the Palestinians. Israel has over 1 million Arabs as its citizens. Why can't Jews be citizens in their homeland, which is part of, I understand the necessity for partition. So I think it's immoral to ask all Jews to make it Judenrein. About the Arab initiative, I also welcome the Arab initiative. I think this is part of what I said, the decline of interstate conflict between Israel and the Arab states. Basically, the Arab initiative speaks about peace with Israel, with a Jewish state. I don't like its details, but I think it's negotiable. If they think that it is take it or leave it, I think it's not the right approach. I would even say that the Israeli government maybe made a mistake in not capitalizing on this initiative in order to deal with the Palestinian issue, but with other issues. But this is, in my view, a positive development in the Arab world, coming to terms with Israel. And I wish, the Arab League will send a delegation, to negotiate with Israel about it. But unfortunately, they are not ready to do so.
There's a question here in the front.
My name is Michael Burmeister. I don't represent anybody. You seem to have said or implied in several times that the Palestinians are incapable of creating either a government or an economy. Yeah. So my question to you is in two parts. First, do you think that Israel bears any responsibility for that inability? And if so, what do you think Israel could do to enable that development, and would it help?
I think we have a clear interest in the Palestinian having prosperity. Hungry neighbors is bad news. So I think Israel invested a lot during the Oslo years in the Palestinian economy. And I wish it would have been, better used by the Palestinians. They forced us basically to destroy part of their economic infrastructure during the Second Intifada. If I take a look at, Palestinian economic performance, it is it is not very good. It's a corrupt society. Very little filters down. Indeed, I'm skeptic about the ability of the Palestinian national movement to build a modern, prosperous Palestinian state. The onus of responsibility is on them. I think we try to help. They had the best fundraisers in the world for their economy, Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres went in the world and tried, to get money to the donors conventions, to give money to the Palestinians. They probably get, in recent years, it is the highest per capita international aid. And they squandered it, so it's, in year 2000, they started a war of terror against Israel. And of course, having a conflict with Israel does not help them economically. Fortunately, as an Israeli, we do much better, and we are able to sustain this protracted conflict economically and socially much better than the Palestinians.
There are lots of people who have questions. Yes, please, with the red. If you could please identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Carolyn Poplin. I'm not here on anybody's behalf. I should say I'm Jewish, and I've always thought of myself as a Zionist. But what about the fact that when Israel conducts the operation in Lebanon, the operation in Gaza, it creates a tremendous wave of sympathy internationally for the Palestinians? I think there's some concern that Hezbollah may have Hamas may have brought this on, but it's possible that even if they don't have as many rockets, every attack like this leaves them in a stronger position. And even if the Arab governments were to go along with your idea, the citizens of those states could overturn those governments just like the Shah of Iran was overturned.
I'm not expert on the international media. I suffer when I read it, yes, part of it at least. I suffer also when I read Haaretz, this is a phenomenon which, I'm not sure I have a good explanation. I think Walter wrote a piece in the Washington Post, explaining, this preoccupation, what the Jews are doing. We don't always get a good press, but in the recent war, actually, most of the world was with us. Who can sympathize with Hamas, basically? Hamas is a genocidal organization, that wants to destroy the Jewish state. So it's, even the Arab moderate countries were with Israel and hope that will do the dirty job for them. We were not very successful, but that's a different topic, So I think that, if I take a look at the polls in Europe, Europe has not been very friendly to Israel. I see in recent, about Gaza, we got more support than the Palestinians, even in Europe. Take Italy, France, England, Germany. And of course, here in America, most Americans support Israel. In my view, for good reasons. So I think it's true, the media, the elite media has liberal, dovish leanings, and I hope that they'll grow up eventually.
Sir, please.
Dan Pollack from the Zionist Organization of America, so I do have an affiliation. I'm a little confused. I hear what you said in your analysis was good about all the reasons for not expecting the policies towards bending towards a two-state solution to have any fruit for the Israeli government. But when you give advice to the prospective prime minister, you say, make sure you don't build any more settlements. If Israel has a claim on that land historically, why shouldn't Israel, if it's not going to ruin the idea of a two-state solution, continue with the natural increase of people who live in the communities in the West Bank?
I didn't say not to build new settlements. In those areas which are important to our security, we have to build them. And, for example, to link Jerusalem to Ma'ale Adumim. But I'm not sure that it's wise to settle next to Nablus or certain places. So basically I want to minimize the friction between the two societies, and some of the settlements obviously do not serve this purpose. Of course, I can understand the Zionist zeal and our commitment to live in any place in our homeland, but unfortunately, there are other people there that we have to take somewhat into consideration. And so I am in favor of selective settlement.
Ambassador Gildenhorn.
I'm curious as to what George Mitchell is going to do all day in his new office in Jerusalem, which means how much pressure will the Obama government put on Israel to negotiate, whatever that means. And also, second part, what will, if Netanyahu wins the election, what will he bring to the equation, his policies?
Thank you.
I think in Israel there were certain fears about President Obama, but we had two tests that, we became less concerned. The first test was, of course, his appointments in the area of foreign policy and defense, which are very reasonable appointments, mainstream, America. And the second indication was what he didn't say, or he kept quiet during the Gaza operation. Basically, I'm not sure we are correct, but the Israeli feeling was that if he doesn't say anything, there is no criticism of what we are doing. Generally, I think that the American policy toward Israel is bipartisan. For many years, there is a large pool of reservoir of support in America, not only among the Jews, for Israel. And there may be frictions between an Israeli government and American government on a variety of reasons. But after all, if I take a look at American Middle East policy, its priorities are not, 2 million Palestinians. There is, 70 million Iran that may go nuclear. I think the Americans have to try to extricate themselves in a positive way from Iraq. Afghanistan is still there. So, how much, and of course, the most important thing for the president is the economy. So, I think that, from what I know, policy making, how much time can you devote to one issue? So Mitchell, came, he's welcome, he draws a nice salary from the American taxpayer, so he will keep him busy. So the power of Mitchell is limited. So I don't think that there will be necessarily frictions. I think Netanyahu, if he wins, understands very well the American scene. He will try, as all Israeli prime minister, or most Israeli prime minister, to minimize any possible tensions with America. For us, the United States is the most important country in the world, for good reason. It is the hegemonic power in the world nowadays, and we have always tried to be very sensitive to American idiosyncrasies.
Hales Fandiari.
Efraim, two quick questions related. Why should the Egyptian and the Jordanian accept such a headache? That's number one. I mean, what should be their incentive? Number one. Number two, Ban Ki-moon was very critical of what happened in Gaza when he visited. The Middle Eastern countries were also equally, critical. Erdogan stumped out for whatever reason, of that, of the meeting in Davos. So I'd like you to sort of elaborate a little bit. It's interesting to see how you see it from the Israeli perspective, that, the world has been supportive, while there is another side to it too. And you sort of say it's only the liberal press who does it, which is not necessarily
Erdogan is not very liberal.
But Erdogan is an ally. I mean, Turkey is an important ally for Israel, unless you decide to wash them up. That's a different story. No. But if you could talk a little bit about how you see that alliance also.
Well, the UN has never been, an important actor in Israeli eyes. We call it, Shmo. It's UN. It's not. It's really not an important actor. So, and Ban Ki-moon is actually rather friendly. He just came out with the clarifications that the UNRWA camps were not attacked, or the schools. He came with, and so he went to try to please us to some extent. It is Turkey is an important issue, of course. The relations with Turkey are very important to us, and the question, is not so much of the Turkish-Israeli relations. The question of the direction of Turkey in general. Where is Turkey going? So I was very involved in the Turkish-Israeli relationship. I think it's very important. And we have to remember that this type of statements made by Erdogan, it's not new. When we eliminated Sheikh Yassin and Rantisi of Hamas, he also came with this type of statement. And afterwards he cooled down, and business is as usual. The question, what will happen now? I see indications that, at least the foreign minister of Turkey is trying to cool down things. I hope cooler heads will prevail. Vis-a-vis Erdogan, what happened? The operation started on Saturday. Olmert was in Ankara on Wednesday. At that time, Olmert was not, the government didn't decide on operation. They discussed Gaza, I'm sure, and probably Olmert told him, we have no plans to attack Gaza. So a few days later, Erdogan is, the Jews lied to me. So it's, and I'm not saying that Olmert is incapable of lying, of course. But it's, and he's an Islamist. He has a soft spot for Hamas, which is despicable in my view. But he has elections soon, in municipal elections. And this political theater which serves him. I think also what he's doing, again, those are, I have no proof. Maybe he's attacking Israel in order to limit further the influence of the military in the Turkish political system, because the military is the one that is most identified with the Turkish-Israeli relationship. He used this to weaken the military, as he has used the relations with Europe to weaken the military a few years ago. So the situation is complex with Turkey. If Turkey decides to go east, then we all have a problem, and it's America has a problem. It's not only us. I don't know what will happen there. I hope. You see, I have a rather good knowledge of AKP and Islamists in Turkey. They are not Hamas, most of them. After the Erdogan in 2005, after he made those statements, which were, again, not that different from Bülent Ecevit a few years before, he sent some of his advisors to Jerusalem. He may do the same now, and I remember I had dinner with them, and two of them drank wine, so it's not, they are Shas, it's not terrible, so we can live with them, we can do business with them. So, but the question of Turkey is not just Turkey-Israel. It's a much larger question which the Americans should be preoccupied with, because Turkey is a very important country.
Please.
Abay Desi, I'm here for the United Nations Information Center, actually. I guess I'm just interested.
It's a bad affiliation.
Well, thank you. I'm interested in hearing your opinion, I guess, as far as why the UN is not seen as an important actor in Israel.
Well, first of all, it's ineffective. You know, we respect actors that can do something. You know, this is why we don't think highly of the Europeans as well. You know, what can they do? And also the UN, you know, I'll put it quite bluntly, is a morally corrupt institution that, you know, having Iran heading the disarmament commission and Libya heading the Human Rights Commission. So, you know, it begs the question what kind of institution the UN is. And I think the record of the UN vis-à-vis Israel, although it improved in recent years, is not one that enlightened institution should be proud of. So I think we are, you know, UN is there, we'll try to do business with them if necessary, but we don't think highly of the UN, and they don't think highly of us as well, so it's okay.
In the back there, please, sir.
Even Shore, two brief questions. The first is, let us suppose, against all expectation, we do get a two-state solution. What would the Jewish settlers on the West Bank, now outside the protection of the Israeli Defense Forces, really want to stay in what would ultimately seem to be becoming a Jewish Kosovo? And secondly,
Jewish?
Kosovo, where the Serbs were down to like 10% of the population and felt more and more incentive to leave. And the second is, even if you had good Palestinian economic development, wouldn't many of the Palestinians essentially still serve as Gastarbeiter in Israel?
Well, the second, I'll address first the second part. I think we don't look for Palestinian Gastarbeiters. We can bring Chinese, Thais, Turks, you know, the world is full of people that are ready to work, and basically we built a fence, which is more or less along the green lines. They didn't ask me, I would have put it somewhere differently. It is, we don't want too much intercourse with Palestine, as well as with the Arabs. I think, you know, we have a very bad experience with Egypt. Very little people to people. We had tourists there. They were subjected to terrorist attacks, so we decided to see the pyramids from pictures rather than viewing. You know, we can live with it. It's a pity that, you know, I'm at the Begin-Sadat Center. In Israel, the intellectuals are the spearhead of the peace camp, but the Egyptians are boycotting the Beha Center as well, other intellectual institutions. So we've learned maybe the hard way that it's not realistic to have, you know, this warm relationship, cold peace with Egypt. We can live with it. Okay, the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra doesn't play in Cairo, it's their loss. We don't see Zamalek, you know, the football team playing in Israel. It's our loss. They play very good. But this is something which is secondary. We don't, basically we want to be left alone. I think that the Israeli instinct now is we build a fence, if we needed a moat with crocodiles, you know, we don't want, leave us alone. This is also our instinct with Egyptian, with the Gazans. You like Hamas? Fine. Hamas will lead you, will doom you to poverty, to ignorance. We don't care. We want, just leave us alone. This is the main goal and instinct of most Israeli, goal of foreign policy. We don't, you know, America wants to bring democracy, you know, we are more limited in our aspiration. Just leave us alone. So I don't think that this will be, they shouldn't expect the type of economic interactions that were before the Intifada, Second Intifada started. Concerning the first question about Israeli settlers in a Palestinian state, well, they take the risk. You know, they want to stay there under their conditions. They are grown-ups. I was against, for example, removing by force the settlers in Gaza. I thought that it was a mistake on part of the Israeli military to remove them by force. If they want to stay, let them stay. If they like, to be, some of them were ready to stay under Palestinian rule. But most Israelis, for good reason, will probably leave. Maybe they'll need some help from the Israeli military, to get compensation. That's the whole, political theater. But of course, I don't trust the Palestinian police to take care of the Jews.
It's 12 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock, rather, and I'm afraid we have to end the session. There are numerous questions. This is probably an endless discussion, which unfortunately we can't end in the time that we have. I'm very grateful that you came. I'm very grateful for Professor Inbar for having addressed us and entertained your questions. And please join me in thanking Professor Inbar.